The next three chapters, that's chapters 12 to 14, present a darker and deeper side to what we've seen, as the spiritual forces and powers in opposition to God's people are exposed and laid bare. The conflict within which the church finds itself is dramatically presented with the woman and the dragon here in chapter 12. Now, whereas the previous scene of the two witnesses took place on the earth with the beast coming out of the abyss, this scene has a far more dramatic and momentous beginning, as both the two main characters, the woman and the dragon, appear as heavenly signs, with the action taking place sort of in heaven and sort of on earth. The main characters are easily identified. The dragon, in verse 9, as that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. That's straightforward. And the woman is pregnant, and she gives birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Sounds as if it's Jesus, doesn't it? Now, the woman herself would appear to be the people of God within both the Old and New Covenants. Jesus was born a Jew from the tribe of Judah and a descendant of King David, and we can see how right from the outset Jesus' life was in danger as King Herod sought to kill this perceived threat to his rule. However, as a new people were birthed at Pentecost, comprising Jew and Gentile, it was the church itself that was soon under attack. The story is one of spiritual warfare being waged by the satanic forces who were pitted against the church. It's also a story of God's protection of his people, as they are kept safe in the wilderness during this sustained onslaught. We also have the period of 1260 days, and the Daniel phrase of a time, times, and half a time as part of the story, indicating the limits placed on these attacks, as well as God's protection. Having already met this time period when looking at the two witnesses and the preaching of the gospel, it could be that this scene is linked to the previous one, and is a different perspective on what or who is attacking the saints. The scene takes place in the wilderness, not a place of choice, and perhaps indicative of the hostile environment of the world itself. But we know already of the sealing and protection that God has promised, and we learn that in the wilderness God takes care of his people. And the phrase "take care of," used on both occasions, really means feed. And again, there's a clear link to the wilderness journey in the Exodus, with God miraculously feeding and sustaining his people throughout this time. The devil himself is portrayed as limited in terms of being unable to resist the heavenly forces, or indeed God's people. But also his time and his power, where he is at large on the earth, is also shown to be limited or short, and as such he is filled with fury. This will be a recurring theme in the next few chapters, where Satan is shown as being limited and ultimately defeated, but yet he is intent in the meantime on attacking and destroying God's people. There's also perhaps the sense that as things move forward towards their conclusion, there's a greater and more open manifestation of his power through his agents that we'll be shortly meeting in the next couple of chapters. The underpinning narrative is consistent though. It is the followers of the Lamb who are also victorious, and that is the truly remarkable thing. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Their overcoming is through the victory won at Calvary. But again we have this theme of the witnessing, testifying church boldly preaching the gospel. And the context is still the same: opposition, oppression, suffering, and even death. But God's people are intent on sharing and spreading the good news of the gospel. And once again, we see the earlier promises of overcoming to the churches being worked out. The declaration that comes from heaven in verses 10 to 12 is key to the whole of Revelation. So far in the visions, the main focus for God's people has been the future hope of God's justice and judgment and the full reign of God and the Lamb. But the declaration is that this time has already started, and is similar to Jesus' declaration that the kingdom of heaven was at hand. This was the promise to the churches of overcoming and victory. And while Satan has great power and can cause immense damage even to God's people, he is a defeated foe through the cross of Calvary. And we can share in that victory through the word of our testimony. This is the mandate for God's people, the declaration of victory now for the followers of Christ, the full extent of the victory won at Calvary. The fullness is yet to be revealed, and that will be at the end of Revelation. But this is the right of every follower of the Lamb, that through the death and resurrection of Jesus, we too can be overcomers.